Well, I thought they asked me what kind of questions will we here be discussing. But I thought maybe we could begin with each of us talking about the favorite color in the rainbow. Mine would be blue.
In the rainbow, blue is my favorite color, but in the rainbow, I would say my favorite color would be red.
Red.
You what?
Blue, yeah. So there are blues, the two of us. We're making a plural.
I gotta say green. Sorry.
So, you see, nobody's curious yellow. Well, I was wondering, listening to you and to the discussions and the meetings, etc., but especially the discussions, when you got too theoretical, and when some poets would say, if to be a poet is Robert Frost, I would not want to be one. If to be a poet is Robert Lowe, I would not want to be one. Then I decided at this moment, if you ever write a poetry, I don't want to see it. But then he, I think, added that, in fact, that he would produce poetry that should not be read anyway. Wonderful. So, my question is, has not all the poetry that could have been written in history been written already? Why do we repeat ourselves, or do we repeat of what has been written before? And why do we do that? So why do we still practice poetry, and what does it mean practicing poetry today from, if we look back, and I do not want to go back to Shakespeare, but let's say Keats or someone, you know, this century, like Lowell or Frost and so on. All right, so if we could try to give an answer to that, who wants to begin? We have been longest around, you know, so you probably remember more than not you, but some of the youngsters.
Specifically. You know, of course, I don't think we rewrite any of this because the content is always changing, and the world around us is very different, and the things of the world, and the way we move through the world is different than before, and languages are constantly changing. So I don't see any necessary repetition in what's being written or not written, how it's written. I think poetry, in some sense, was always an exclusive audience. You go back these earlier, in the English language, you know, books were printed in 300 copies. Back in I don't know, you specialize in the Romantics. I don't know when Wordsworth and Coleridge, when these books came out, you know, how many, I just passed among friends, maybe a few hundred copies of the books.
Well, you know, what's interesting is in that period, the best-selling poet was Walter Scott, and who would sell 50,000 copies. So, and then Byron comes along, and he's sexy, and Walter Scott is not. And so then Byron is the best-selling poet. But there's actually a book called The Reading Nation in the Romantic Period that gives you sales and print runs.
Okay.
And you look at that, and what you realize is the print runs were 50,000 for Walter Scott, 2,000 for Wordsworth, negative .0001 for Blake. So I personally find this very heartening.
And for Keats?
You know, 300, like a very small print run. I mean, so those things, the people who now get taught, I mean, almost nobody reads Walter Scott unless they're forced to. But in that moment, he was the most popular poet. So I think that also is a real salutary lesson to people who want to, you know, who are worried about contemporary popularity. You don't know who's going to last. You don't know who's going to matter to people hundreds of years from now. So,
as I showed you the anthology, there is not one word, with the exception of Emily Dickinson, that we would remember, and put together in the 90s of the 19th century. By a Czech, you know, who looked around at that time and met hundreds of poets. None of them is ever remembered.
I just remember what the Irish novelist John Banville said once when he was being interviewed, and he was asked what his next book would be about, and he just said, "Oh, the usual: love, art, sex, and death." And you know, it's a beautiful offhand remark that art is always about these things, and there is repetition in that sense. But what is changing and isn't being repeated is the language, and the language speaks to us in different ways in each generation. And each generation needs to hear these core subjects spoken about in its own language, closest in its ear, like in this really intimate way. And I think that's what writers of literature in general have to do in each generation. They have to go back to the same themes, because as far as so far, they haven't found a way to stop people dying, and it's one of the great human horizons that has to be faced. And same with sex, love, etc. Are they the same or different? So that's what's changing, I think, the language.
Obviously, we do read, what had been written before, and we heard today, those acquisitions taken from sources and poets and other poets. And I remember there was one here, a lady who wrote a book about readers, writers becoming the most voracious readers of the writers before. And in fact, they learn more from writers who had written before, and they read then, let's say, at school or universities and so, or even creative writings or courses, right? So yes, still, I come back to this question. What is it? What's the drive to say, I'm not like Frost, I'm not like Lowell, I can understand that. But
okay, I thought that was really bothering you. I think they embrace it, you know? I think this is a way to differentiate.
So, yeah, here's Robert Frost, his friend who died during the First World War, Edward Thomas, is really coming back now because someone discovered that Robert Frost and Edward Thomas, which was known, but sort of maybe more public, were very, very close friends. And friends in spirit, and friends as poets. Sort of, they, in fact, during those long walks, were creating poetry together. And then there was, of course, the widow who interfered, I think, with somehow, or with there.
He's always a widow.
Yeah.
He's always an interfering.
No, women can do it even before they did.
That's so much less misogynistic.
And men can do that too, human beings. Well, still.
I quite like Frost. I always have. I grew up with him. But especially, maybe you have an answer to this. A lot of the women poets say my age or a little bit younger when you mention, or if Frost comes up in the conversation, they really they don't like him. And for I guess some feminist reasons and other reasons, I'm not sure, but just completely dismiss him with a sneer. Much more than men. Have you come across this?
No, I think there's lots of position taking in any generation for different reasons. Like as you say, some of it might be feminist, some of it might be, I think in Stephen's talk earlier, he was talking about, am I remembering correctly? It was Anton.
Yeah.
And it's like, look, Anton is advocating very powerfully for a form of poetry, what he calls a talk poem. And he wants to write in open forms, and he wants to, and it's a classic Oedipal move, right? Let's kill a few daddies and make space for ourselves. And in a way, there's nothing more conventional than, publicly assassinating your fathers. And so to me, that's just like a really old rhetorical trope. And and it's polemical and it's painful if you are a partisan of Frost and this may be my wishy-washy American eclecticism, but I sort of feel like, Frost, yay, Lowell, yay, Anton, yay, on creative writing, yay, fine. I sort of feel like there are things to be said for all of them, and there are things, to be pushed on with all of these writers too. And partly I just have a real aversion to those kinds of militant, this way or the highway. Sure. And I think that, but on the other hand, people who feel very passionate about certain lines of transmission, they're wonderful arguers for poets, and they often make great anthologies, and so they've been hugely you know, I mean, the Donald Allen anthology exists precisely to kick the crap out of a whole, you know, so I feel like, you know, again, I'm sort of agnostic about that. When Stephen said that thing about if Frost, if, you know, it reminded me of James Schuyler, one of the New York School poets, who was Auden's secretary, and he's like, if what Auden's writing is poetry, I'm not going to be a poet. You know, so it's clear that, you know, there's this way in which sometimes these very strong poets present such a difficulty and a barrier for people that they want to say, if that's the only thing that equals poetry, I don't want to be a poet. And look, Allen Ginsberg was considered like a shambolic non-poet for a long time. So I feel like it's really, you know, that sense of people trying to say poetry is bigger than the house of the sonnet, or it's bigger than the house of... That's a move that people make to try to make space for themselves.
That's a good example when you mention the sonnet, because it's not only the bigger than but the house of the sonnet changes
Which
and
I love,
changes and
but
changes.
yeah.
Right? I mean, it's a very different house, right? I mean, from I don't know, Petrarch and Shakespeare up to lower, as a matter of fact.
Even beyond that. But I think one of the most polarizing things in 20th century poetry was the story of modernism, and that modernism and the critical story of modernism that as somehow progressing beyond the Victorian period and throwing it aside and all its values served to precisely exclude a poet like Edward Thomas because he was not seen as progressive enough. He was seen as a Georgian throwback, writing about nature in old forms, whereas Frost somehow got away with it just by kind of boxing his way through all the other people, whereas Thomas was dead. But I think that critical narrative of modernism has proved very divisive way beyond into the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I think that argument is still going on in David Anton's comment about Lowell and about Frost. It is still the same fight taking place, that I don't want to be a traditional poet who doesn't is not experimental in the way that we all should be as good modernists and post-modernists. And what I feel is now refreshing is that now the modernist narrative is waning as a way to explain what went on, and not just in poetry, but also in literature and the arts way beyond. Other stories are coming out, and other poets, other writers, other artists. And one of the ones that warmed my heart most of all was precisely Thomas, who I think is just a fantastic poet.
But still, yes, I am provoked by a statement like that, because I do remember also that Robert Frost, let's say, who looks very much like a traditional sort of humanity or did, you know, at that time. And it was interesting that it was Pound who, in fact, felt, you know, that this man is writing the way he is, that he belongs to the modern development of poetry. And he was the one who said, you know, this man is traditional and modern. And my question was really, is not the traditional and the modern making new and new, or make new again and again, sort of emptying out the very potential? You mentioned the languages is changing, but the world is changing too. Do we have new needs, or is it just a change of the language and the change of the world? Or do we have new needs that are not known before, like for poetry? Do people have new needs for poetry? Are these the old stock that are still the motivation and initiation?
Well, I don't know, but I'd be curious to think about the solitariness and the silence. Poets, I think, this may be a generalization, probably have needed this in the past. But somehow I would suspect that with the way things are with the media and the onslaught, that it may be, if we talk about needs, it may be much more of a need now for poets. But I may be wrong, because the younger generation maybe doesn't crave this. They're growing up and they work within this fast media. So I think it's an interesting question. Yeah, it is something else. And so I think it's an interesting. But I also had a question about UK and Ireland, Irish poetry. I read a fair modernism never really took hold, right, as it did in America. I mean, you had Bunting and some people that moved the post-pounding and stuff, but when I read the poets that became popular, I never got the feeling that it took hold of there as it did in the States. Is that,
Well, I mean,
in general, is that true more or less?
Ireland and England are extremely conservative.
Yeah.
To this day, Ireland perhaps even more so than England. But that kind of experimental poetry which came out of modernism was always being written there. And always in England was a continuous line, like you said, Bunting, and then even beyond Bunting to the present day. But I think the difference between England and America in this respect is that major attention is and was given in America to experimental poets like John Ashbery or A.R. Ammons. These were considered mainstream poets, whereas in England they were all kind of hiding in a cellar in Cambridge with Jeremy Prynne. But now that has changed, that people like Prynne have come out into the daylight. They've been led up the stairs, as it were, and Prynne's collected poems are published by Blood Axe. And I think in the last 10 years there's been a huge shifting of the tectonic plates, and that the situation is a lot more Catholic and resembles more America than it did before.
I think it was Stephen again, maybe I'll try to remember it, but who used in one sentence sort of reference to the establishment in the poetry, and now you say mainstream. From the distance, those of us who are interested in, let's say, poetry in English, be it from UK, be it from whatever English-speaking sort of country, I think could say and could feel that there was, all through the decades after the Second World War, because I'm referring to the time that we have experienced, one major line, one major tendency, even a model sort of, one or two or three poets, that dictated what the establishment of American poetry, or mainstream of American poetry, had been. Be it the Beat, be it the New York, which in fact I feel during the colloquy came up quite substantially, O'Hara and Ashbery, etc. Then it was, and I mentioned it when we did our anthology, Theodore Redgate. So, is there any such a tendency in contemporary American poetry scene? I mean, what is or who is the mainstream now? Is it possible to say something about establishment in poetry for those who are the models for younger poets? I know that creative writing programs, in the 60s when I was there, 69, and then again 89. Most of them were trying to imitate one or two sort of model poems. So what is it now, or is it so fragmented that we could not say anything, that we're so postmodern that we do not have a major tendency?
I remember in the 2001, Robert Hass had, that series, The Best American Poetry Anthologies.
Yes,
yes. And he had some kind of survey of what he thought were tendencies.
Internet or something.
But he said he thought there were, three, what he thought in 2001 was that there were like three, I'd say, major strands, and one was a kind of a more an experimental verse where people aren't as interested so much in content as in exploration of different formal possibilities. What he called a kind of more mainstream line of verse that was interested in expression and experience. And I can't remember if he called the third like a neo-formalist, but he kind of was laying out these three terrains and sort of agnostically saying there seems to be good work done in all of them and really mediocre work done in all of them too. And if anything, I was thinking about it now, 11 years later. And I don't know, I'd be curious, very curious to hear what Carrie and Justin think. Because I don't think,
As
I
an
think-
outsider,
I
as
think
a yeah.
You would definitely say that there are, let's say, establishments, not an establishment. I would say, you know, there, you know, and that things are more fractured, but there are identifiable lines, some of which I thought were really touched on today. And so you'll get auras around creative writing programs or cities or groups or coteries, but I think it's much harder to say. And even if you look at the way prizes are given out, they're quite interestingly schizophrenic. So in 1 year, National Book Awards will go to a whole bunch of experimental poets. Well, and all of these terms are fighting words, right? I actually want to kill myself when I hear experimental poet, because if, you know, it's like, well, Stephen, all poetry is experimental, which is also a fudge. But nevertheless, if you sort of feel like, look, Ashbery writes Sestina's, A. Stallings writes Sestina, you know, I sort of feel like, what are we actually talking about when we say experimental? We tend to mean a group vibe, and a group attitude, and a group affect. And but one can also say there's a kind of meat and potatoes poetry in America that's in the main line of the American demotic, that's not going to be theoretical in an obvious way. It's not going to like make you intellectually disturbed, but it might move you. It might be very, and so and that kind of line of poetry is still very flourishing. But I would say there are several different nodes of gravitational nodes.
I understand, but still, I have a feeling that there is a certain sort of vogue, you know, which is too easy and too probably cheaper. And '89, when I spoke to people around, you know, it seemed to be Elizabeth Bishop.
Yeah, I mean, there are waves
You
of
know,
people. There are ways, like she's
Yes.
fashionable for a moment or someone's. But I think that sense of having, you know, the pope you follow, there might be micro popes, but I don't think there's not a there aren't people running around saying, you know, it's Lowell or Ashbery. You know, I mean, you can't. It's
Well,
not
I
even.
understand that,
You
yes.
can't even say it's language poets versus humana. You know, so in a way, I don't care. Do you think I'm totally?
No, I think you're totally right. I don't think that there's ever, I mean, there's some strong vogue. I think it's very fragmented. And unfortunately, younger, quote, poets that are in these, what I call fish hatchery, poetry stick, fish stick poets, they, when you come across the people that influence them most, if they'll talk about, happen to be often their teachers.
Exactly.
Or one or two peers that they know. And this has gotten pretty bad. I mean, I think in the old days maybe it wasn't so bad, but now so many of the teachers of the masters and mistresses of finishing school poetry come from this. So it's like an assembly line, an incestuous assembly line they're producing. And when you ask the aspirations of so many of them, the biggest aspirations in life are to go back into that system and teach. And not teach literature so much, but to teach writing. But they're coming from it and then going back. And so many of them, when I talk to them, really, some interesting fine talents will just idolize their teachers. I mean, as their specific teachers in their MFA programs. But as far as Vogue and Bishop, Bishop was unusual because she has had a big importance. A lot of, you know, when law was dismissed, and also a lot of male and female poets, but especially feminist poets came in, and Bishop has had her influence. But I would say that Dickinson has had more of an influence, even now, and continuous influence than maybe any of, if you had to pick one poet now that still has this strange influence, and maybe you know Susan Howe's book, and lots of books, but lots of people have locked onto her. You can lock onto her in many, many ways, and so if there is somebody in Vogue that I had to name, much more than Whitman or something, as far as it would be Emily Dickinson of all people. That would just be a chance that I could throw that out.
Well, I would have to feel, and coming back to Bishop, you know, again, when I met people like Pinsky, Bidar, Hess, and so they all were sort of disciples, or they felt, you know, or followers, and so, and they taught the students also, you know, in the bishop, which is not a very different line from Bishop Dickinson sort of line. You know, this is quite an interesting thing that could even be sort of somehow combined in the forces of.
I'm not sure what the line would be there. I mean, I would see I wouldn't see a direct line between Bishop and
No.
the more, I mean, she has more to Lowell and other people, but you know, you do have, I think lots of poets that would come out of Bishop. Maybe not Pinsky, of course, would be attractive as a sort of formalist. So she can attract people that write in a certain kind of meter. But I think a lot of people are attracted to her for lots of other reasons: personality, her content, her the metaphysical nature of her poetry. Has she had influence on the island?
I'm sure she's huge in England and Ireland as well. From the 80s on, she's like a major influence. But I thought perhaps the best person to ask about what's in vogue and what isn't in vogue might be Stephen Delbos himself, because just in the summer himself and two of the friends set up a new internet magazine which utilizes the best, some of the best talents in technology to create a very beautiful looking site, but also Stephen's inbox, I think, for the past few months would be full of exactly the kind of poetry that's being written right now. So he might be able to say something really.
As a matter of fact, I also wanted to ask if you could describe a little bit more those poets that Goldsmith and so, you know, that replaced those Frosts and who was the other one?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Stanley Kunitz has an interesting phrase about Lowell that connects to some of the things you're saying, that basically since Lowell's death in American poetry, there's been a democratization of genius. And that, you know, there's not this one or two poets anymore that you can look up to, but, you know, there's just so many. And I don't know, one thing that I've noticed in editing this journal, but also in Maureen's talk this morning with a lot of the quotes, that there's a lot of irony and this kind of, you know, poems that are just dripping with irony, and there's almost, in a lot of work, a feeling that I get reading it that poets are almost nervous to put themselves out there. It's not cool. It's not done to really put yourself on the line, and so I see a lot of poets kind of retreating behind irony or retreating behind, you know, word games. So one of the important anthologies, American anthologies, was this American Hybrid that came out a few years ago, and you know, it was positing this idea that the poets in this anthology were supposedly connecting the bridge between the Donald Allen anthology and the Louis Simpson anthology and so forth. But you know, most of them are kind of language-based poets, and it's all about language rather than experience. And so, also, you know, the same thing with poets like Goldsmith, who are literally just retyping other texts. You know, I mentioned the traffic reports. There's one called Day, a book called Day, where he just retypes a New York Times Sunday newspaper on, you know, and that's a book. And so, you know, why this is, I think it's a lot of complex, the way that society is changing, language is changing. You know, it would take a long time to get into all the reasons behind it, but I do generally see I would call it a kind of retreat behind irony, or a retreat almost behind language, and there's almost a distrust of experience in a lot of American poetry, and the language rather is, and the materiality of language is foregrounded. So
this irony, I think, I guess this is something from a long time ago, but I remember when my first book came out in the early 70s, and I wrote some just straightforward love poems, quite a few in this book, and lots of people just hated them, you know, in the States. I mean, they were just, as you said, you can't write this way anymore, you know, it has to be ironic or something behind it. And so I think that's been there since at least probably world, for a long, long time in America. Maybe it's come out more and more and more on this personal, being able to express yourself, some angst or personality. But I think there's lots of poets who do that also, and aren't covering themselves. What do you think? I had a question of this whole, you could call it almost a school, Perloff school, and this language poets. How do you relate? How do you relate to the poetry yourself? Not intellectually, but say emotionally, Marie, or when you feel it? Does it feel it inside?
It depends. A lot of the people I was quoting today, partly because, again, I was taking the category of the rainbow of American poetry as the kind of predicament, and since I found that it led me to these poets who were much more like registering problems and either the psyche or the state, and often they were registering it through this sort of kind of ironized, somewhat distantiated, and whether it was these sort of comical, anxious catalogs of somebody like Dickman, or this sort of austere sort of stuff in Armand Trap. And what I guess what I feel about most of those poets, I admire them, but I don't love them. And even thinking earlier about something Carrie said and something that Stephen just said, in terms of some models, or people who come into fashion as people to read. One thing, there's definitely still, it seems to me, this is just sort of anecdotal, but it seems to me that Plath is still enormously important, particularly for women poets, but not only women poets, and also as a route to intense registrations of experience. And so one poet who, Dorothea Lasky, is a very voicey poet who's very like, yeah, and you can tell that she's read her Plath, but she also has these very strong images. And it is interesting to feel like, Timothy Donnelly in his book, and I quoted something from him, he has a poem called The New Sincerity, which already tells you about the attitude. And yet some of the poets I didn't talk about, there are cheap ironies and there are expensive ironies. There are cheap sincerities, there are expensive sincerities. What I want is a poet who's earning his or her language and stance. And I feel like there are like cheesy versions of people on all over the spectrum. And I also feel like that tone, that question of defensiveness or that anxiety, you see it in fiction. You see it all over U.S. fiction too. So I feel like it's not just a problem of poetry, it's a problem of, the general gestalt of usually middle class, often white, but not just white writers. And I think that there's this interesting thing too about some of these, Devin Johnston, he publishes with another guy, a press that publishes poets who are considered more experimental, and he's also been a great, they've kept Robert Duncan in print and people from earlier generations. But his own poetry is a very classical, austere, beautiful kind of verse, and if it's ironic in the way, Horace is ironic, right? It's not ironic in the way, Stephen Colbert is ironic. So I feel like they're actually, and for good or for ill, a poet like Sharon Olds, it's like she's not the queen of irony, right? A poet like Sharon Olds is like, here's my body, here's my ovaries, here's my sex acts, here's my children, here's his penis, here's my trauma, there it is on the plate, and that's a thing that's been available for American poets. Some people will date it to Redkey, some people to Lowell, some people. And whether you want to call it confessionalism or whether you want, what does Lowell say, why not say what happened? That sort of militant plain style. That seems to me, that's still an option for some people, but that you can get kind of anxious responses to that. Like, this is too naked, or there's not enough thinking going on here. And so
with Holmes, I would say it's not enough thinking going on.
Yeah.
But it's
Thinking, yes.
One of the reasons why language poetry was interesting was, as Stephen says, the great quote somebody saying that the good thing about conceptual poetry is you don't have to read it. But what is interesting to read is the theory about conceptual poetry, and I found that over the years and I'm really stimulating. Even though I never write or even wish to write that kind of language poetry, they are dealing with fundamental philosophical concerns connected with the literary art. That's what people should be thinking about. But yet the formalists were they thought it was okay just to write about, household chores in rhyme, and they had done their job. That the poet has to think and has to be intellectual as well. But the problem, as I saw it with language poetry, is it edged out completely any lyrical aspect of the art, that somehow that was treacherous and had to be excluded. And what I see in the new generation of poets, some of whom Maureen mentioned, but one of the ones I admire very much is Reginald Shepherd, who came out of that milieu and yet is a fantastic lyrical poet. He also came out of it with all the right, ticking all the right ethnic and sexual boxes. He was from an impoverished area of the Bronx. He was black and he was gay. I mean, unfortunately, he died of AIDS a few years ago. But he came out of that experimental tradition, but yet is a beautiful lyric poet. And lyricism is one of the highest values in his work. So that, for me, was fascinating to see a figure like Shepherd bring these two things back together again where they belong.
Lyricism, of course, has some strong emotion. Now, playfulness does not have to have that. I believe that some of the poets, who are the language poets, are playful, that what I would say, the sentiment or the emotion of that I feel is part of lyricism, lyrical poetry, is missing. And this is poetry that somehow misses me and as a reader. I do not really feel that I have to I don't know, do people remember someone who was known in the 60s and he disappeared, Richard Kostelanetz?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, he was very playful with language already in the 50s and in the 60s. And I like that playfulness, but I never, and I argued with him because I knew him personally. I said, well, where is the poetry? And he said, that's the language. The language, the language he was using it has not been used, in sort of life and so. So I don't know what my question is here, because we are seeing that, of course, there's a variety. There's not one model, there's not one vote, etc. And still, my question is whether it is not coming in cycles where you have more stress on the, as you say, sincerity, frankness of the self. As Gary said, he was writing love poems, just straightforward. That means offering. The poet is offering himself with everything, brain and breast included, or looking for a persona or something that is the mediator, like this T.S. Eliot sort of kind, not daring enough to go all the way to the final line. Is it now coming back to the, let's say, Eliotic is very vague, so rather than the other, that means the one that was expressed in Ginsberg and O'Hara and so this personalism. Is something like that happening now? In poetry and in literature.
Maybe this is innovation, but I guess I feel like I see a lot of coexistences. I feel like I see some very emotionally immediate poetry of lyricism, but I also see, for example, there was a really interesting book, Rachel Zucker, youngish, she's probably late 30s at this point, maybe 40, a book came out called The Museum of Accidents. And it's a kind of, she has a long Ginsbergian line, but it's a book that's partly about being a mother and living in Brooklyn and it's novelistic, and partly about having, I can't remember if it was an ovarian sister, but there's something very dramatic and reproductive going on in this book, and it's very deeply, and it's written in a high key, and she really pulls it off, and I really kind of liked that book. And I read it in a very absorbed way, as if I were reading a novel. And I almost never read, usually if I read something, it'd be like, I read a bit and I had to put it aside and then I read it. But this was like, oh my God. and she kind of is toggling between the social world and her marriage, and so I just remember feeling it was very emotionally immediate. It was also very artful, but it wasn't full of these kinds of defenses. But I also think
The name again?
Zucker,
Yeah.
Zucker, Rachel Zucker, and but I also feel that there's a very vibrant tradition of wit, and there's also probably a more pressured sense of not having to. I mean, partly I don't know who said it, but poets don't get to choose their temperament, right? And so I sort of feel like all of these things is a very complicated alchemy of what your temperament is, and then what's in the air. And sometimes you're lucky and your temperament resonates well with the period, and sometimes it just doesn't resonate at all. And people go to poetry for different reasons. And so I always feel a little sorry on behalf of Homo Dune, and one never needs to feel sorry on behalf. But really people he's clever and he has no heart. And I sort of feel like, have you actually read those poems? And that there's a way in which they demonstrate all this intellectual brio, and then there's like a knife going right into your head. So I don't think that a certain kind of playfulness has to be opposed to feeling, although often it is. So I just would like to say that too.
And you can have experimental poetry that's not necessarily, you would use the word playful.
Exactly.
For example, I mean, I'm talking about not American poets now, but for example, Vallejo, who's translated very well. You have earlier Vallejo, it's a little more straight. And then you have so much of Vallejo that you would have to say it's experimental in some way, and maybe a little playful, but you feel some deep passion in it anyway, even though you could some people would call it language poetry in a way. Celan, the same way, you have his lyrical poems, and you have these compact things, but somehow when you're reading, this is a translation, I read a little German, but you still feel that there's something deep going on there, something in those poems. So I agree. I think that in the States, as a poet, if I were doing an anthology, I would put everything, things. I'm very eclectic, and I'm eclectic in my tastes. I mean, I have my own what I like particularly, but I like a lot of things, and I don't think that there's any. And also, it's not just what I like. I don't really think, as a whole, in the States, you could take any line of poetry and say that it's really, really strong. But it's interesting. There's an interesting book to read if you haven't. And it's that make some comments on American poetry, but also on is the interviews that O'Driscoll did with Seamus Heaney called Stepping Stones. And I would really recommend it. It's a nice thick book to read it carefully. And Heaney makes some comments in there briefly. Of course, he's not too familiar with the American scene. He would say it's a dummy. There's become a dumbing down of the acoustic core of what he calls the acoustic core of what poetry is. This is what Heaney what poetry is in American poetry. And he thinks that a lot of it comes out because of this incredible people are schooled horizontally and not vertically into the various traditions or canons. And he also makes, I like Ashbery, it took me a long time, and some of Ashbery, but initially I really resisted, though I love Stevens, which is funny because they said if you like Stevens, you should like Ashbery, but I didn't, because Ashbery somehow for me, and still is a little bit snide or on a certain level, which I don't warm up to. Not to say that it doesn't make him a good poet, but Heaney talks about Ashbery now being what he would say a shopping mall poet. Very, very good, but that he never got beyond this kind of irony to embrace, of course, Heaney's being a moralist, some greater vision in poetry. This is what Heaney says. And, So there's this strange mix, but I think Ashbery represents this. I mean, if you read Ashbery, he's not so much commenting from the outside, he's coming from within a
But
certain.
it would not be, you could not expect a vision of
Yeah.
of a side, of a
Yeah.
type, you know, like even Ginsberg would have, so
Yes.
let's say. That's very different, I mean, this is not to say that there is no vision, I mean, in
Yeah.
Ashbery, but it's probably fragmented, ironic, etc., etc. So it is eclectic too, in a way.
Yes,
You
yes.
speak, you know, you say you're eclectic, but I think Ashbery too is eclectic.
Of course.
I think a great quote, a great American quote that Seamus Heaney found after living in the country for so many decades is Miłosz. And what he appreciates there is this grandstanding moral tone that is like a village schoolmaster in many respects. And that's what Ashbery doesn't provide. Ashbery is too low-key, too polite almost, and civil in his tone. And he's a poet I admire hugely, but it's a wonder to me that he's just never been able to tune into the American wavelength, as you said, like so many points. Certain poets he has appreciated very deeply,
But Herbert also, he appreciated.
yeah, but Miłosz was like God.
Yeah.
But I was interested in what you said about anthologies, that if I were to put together an anthology, I think this, to bring things in a completely different direction, I think that this is probably going to happen in the years ahead, that everybody will be making an anthology, that it won't be this prestigious thing that, you know, made by a major publisher, but you can make an anthology of your favorite poems from the 17th, 18th, 21st century, and, you know, release it as a Mobi file, which you put in your Kindle. And what I feel now as a poetry reader, I lack that, and I think that that is going to happen because, and certain anthologies will pick up and just travel virally, insofar as poetry can be viral. So I look forward very much to this, to the opportunity.
It has been happening if you look at American anthologies. I mean, you had either representative, whatever that means, right?
Yeah.
Or you had Lowenfels, you know, bringing something, it's a topic, or Vietnam, it's a, you know, so it's a subject, it's a topic. Or then you would have a generational sort of, so it has been happening.
Well, there's been a lot of it, but it's just with present circumstances now, that everyone can do it. There will be more of them out there, and certain ones will be picked and just travel like horizontally again, and it won't be top down as it was before through major publishing houses.
Yeah.
I can't myself, I mean, I read lots of anthologies when I was younger, but I can't read anthologies much anymore. I mean, I don't look forward to them. I think I just burn out on them, and I just, you know, now I'm just trying to consolidate and read certain
The purpose.
poets. Maybe it's a
us.
laziness, but you know, there's just too many anthologies, too many for me to cut through,
But for us, from the distance, of course,
Yes.
anthology is sort of source of information. I mean, who's around, what is around, you know. So that's the first sort of meeting, the first encounter
Yes.
with American poetry, if I'm interested in American poetry. You know. So this question that you asked, in fact, and Justin already answered, maybe we turn to Maureen. How would her poetry anthology look like? I mean, you gave us a little bit of a taste. I mean, with your quotes, but those were, would they be sort of the essence, the essential sort of part?
They'd be part of it, but they wouldn't necessarily be an essence. And I think probably also teaching your syllabi or de facto anthologies. And so I think of, you know, I get a chance to make these provisional anthologies whenever I'm teaching a course. And sometimes they're about contemporary, or sometimes they're about longer histories of forms and questions from, say, 1800-ish till now. And so, but that's different from, as it were, trying to give a slice of the pie right now, you know. And so, and I probably, like Carrie, I probably, if I were doing that, would tend toward the eclectic, but make I would hope good discriminations among the different schools. Yeah.
Well, thought so that we sort of take something, some types and also suggestions for reading with us home, and then look at the internet and read bookstores and can get there. If not anthologies, if we could probably nominate or name 1 or 2 contemporary poets that you think we should turn to as readers in the months and days to come, that might be useful.
Well, I would recommend, this is again very peculiar to my taste, I guess we'll all have to, we were asked to think of someone. A poet you may not know, American poet Rebecca Seiferle, who I think is one of the great poets now in English in America from the Southwest. She's about 60, she's been around a long time. I would recommend anything you can find. Seiferle, S-E-I-F-E-R-L-E, has about 5 books out, very important books within their own genre. Eleanor Vilner is a big fan of hers. But somehow Seiferle is much surpassed Vilner as a poet. Maybe you know Eleanor Vilner's poetry quite fine, but somehow her agenda has dominated her poetry, whereas Seiferle comes out of that same mindset, but I think is a truly intellectual, lyrical poet. And I would recommend 2 more quick. North American Canadian poet Robert Bringhurst. And as a writer in all genres, like if you pick Miloš, as a poet, essayist, whatever, incredible, and translator, and he has about 25 languages in his brain, and is a leading expert also in Heidegger, wrote the Bible of Elements of Typographical Style, has lots of poetry out. He lives on an island so far away, but he's very, very well known in Canada. There's a big separation somehow between Canadian writers and most American writers don't know much about Canadian, except for a few Canadian writers, of the great writers.
I've noticed, however, that English is more, the people in the United Kingdom would be more familiar with him because in the London Review of Books he appeared a few times, also interviews, etc. Were not in the New York Review of Books.
No, I think I always think if a Canadian should get the, it's crazy, should deservedly get the Nobel, it would be hands down Bringhurst, at this point in his life. But he's not that well known stateside. He published with Copper Canyon early on, but Sam Hamill said he couldn't publish too much because he didn't promote himself enough. He wasn't out there with the poetry. He was more out there with the typography and the pounding things. So he didn't. My own personal favorite poet in just a very personal way is a poet from upstate New York who lives there. He's not originally, but he's lived there outside, an hour, maybe and a half from Syracuse. Michael Jennings. He raises Siberian Huskies, lives on a hillside, and writes incredibly really tuned into the language. And so Michael Jennings, and you can find stuff online by Jennings. So I can say those.
Thank you
3.
Thank you for the personal references. We go on.
Yeah, I've already said a couple of people who I both actively like and didn't really discuss. And one is Devin Johnson. He has 4 books out. And he also has a book of essays, which are lovely. And I also I do like Anne Carson, the poet Anne Carson, who's Canadian born, but works mainly in the U.S. at this point. A classicist and poet, and I don't like everything of hers equally, but I just, in terms of, sometimes I like things too much that I don't want to teach them because if the students don't like them, I feel like I don't want to teach them, and I feel that would be hostile. So some poems that matter enormously to me, I just can't do it. So I really feel very strongly about her. And and then Katie Peterson has a young poet who only has one book out, but 2 more coming out in the next 2 years. And I think she's very, very talented and moving. And she toggles between. That's definitely a lyric. She's definitely in a lyric key. So yeah, I guess I'd stop with that.
I suppose at the top end of the scale is a very established poet whose name is mentioned would be for me Paul Muldoon. It's been translated into Czech by Olomouc's own Petr Mikeš a few years ago. Whether he's American or Irish, that argument shouldn't go on for a long time, but I think Louis MacNeice said that poets write nothing good between the ages of 35 and 65, and Muldoon has kind of shown that to be untrue, that, you know, middle age has been good to him. He's very prolific and one of the most playful poets, and I think it was Helen Bender said that he's like, you know, a lifesaver, that there's a hole in the middle where the feeling should be, and I agree with Maureen in that that's an incorrect characterization of his work. And of the young American poets, one I was very happy to encounter a few years ago was Ernest Hilbert, who spent his young years on, whether you view it as the dark side of the force or not, but in the experimental camp, disjunctive, or as Stephen Bird says, the elliptical poets. And his first book of poems, though, was entitled 60 Sonnets, and purely sonnets, but fantastic for their sprezzatura, their wit, the way they surprise you. A sonnet can be a very mechanical device as the poet dutifully brings you to the final couplet. Hilbert has invented a new kind of sonnet rhyme scheme which he uses fantastically. He has lyrical poems, he has really nastily satirical poems. He has a huge range like that. I think his next book is entitled 60 More Sonnets, but I'll happily take more of the same from Mr. Hilbert. So that would be mine.
Well, if I may add my some following of poetry, it's wide range, but it made me even sort of think of trying to translate an African-American poet, Joseph Komuniaka, and I found him first very, very close to what we would call jazz-inspired poetry, and also very much emotionally I could identify with his experience from his rural Louisiana, with my own sort of childhood, you know, and sort of relationship with father and family and the environment where I grew up in, and I found that very, very. Also, having grown up on radio as the real center of culture, sort of in general, you know, and because living in a village, you do not go to a concert or to a theater every day, once a year probably, but you listen to the radio, and this is what sort of molded, shaped, you know, Yusuf's really feeling of culture, his own culture in general, and so Komuniaka is still interesting. It's changing now, and I don't know whether it's changing for my liking the best way, but this is his problem, not mine. So, well, and maybe if people, yes, I just wanted to say if you have something to suggest, you know, and share with us. Yeah.
I had a comment on this anthology thing. This guy from North Carolina, Bill Harmon, has been publishing the 100 most anthologized poems and the 500 most anthologized poems. And maybe the people who win the prizes are the people who protest because of gender or race, like the ones Brad and I had mentioned, Natasha, what's her name? I can't say her name. Trethewey and Nikki Finney. They win the book awards and so on. But if you go back, you don't have to go back all the way to Seamus Heaney's Barkman. who of course must have been a Danish citizen at one time. If you go on to the first poem, I talked about this over lunch, that we have in English, Beowulf, which is the correct pronunciation of that. Beowulf is why has this lasted? What is happening in it? Well, he is communicating something which is an eternal human problem. Of course, what happens in Beowulf is that a Swedish tourist goes to Copenhagen and gets drunk, and then he has to fight his own monster. And the irony comes in because he does it again, and then he has to fight the monster's mother, Grendel's mother. I mean, what's new? You fight the problems that you have created yourself, and you're trying to write yourself out of them. I think this is a very powerful tradition in any kind of literature, and certainly also in poetry.
What would be new would be that you have to fight two mothers. Okay, who else? Yes.
I would like to suggest a poet that I personally admire, maybe more than any other poet I've read recently, and he's been around for quite a while, a compatriot of Justin's, Dennis O'Driscoll, wonderful poet.
I would second that. I quite like O'Driscoll's poetry.
Sorry?
I quite like O'Driscoll's.
Yeah. But I also wanted to add something, kind of on a personal note here. A question to you as poets. I've been writing poetry all my life, and it's all I really cared about doing. And my attitude towards poetry changed a few years ago with this, the environmental change, when I began to notice physically, we knew 30 years ago what was happening. But it's only in the last few years that we can really feel it, and we see it, and we can see the future better every day. And we know that nothing is being done about it, really, seriously. And I found that it affected my writing. I thought, well, gosh, what is there to say now? You can't be witty and playful and capricious as we once thought. Well, nature is our guide or whatever. Nature is a fundamental value in poetry, and it's changing, and it's being destroyed. So I just wonder how you feel about that as poets, and how it might bear up on the future of poetry and the present nature of poetry.
Well, I think two American poets that linked onto that a long time ago and really moved. Snyder and Merwin.
You're right, yeah, sure.
And I think, and of the people I mentioned this morning, Juliana Spar is the person most overtly concerned about environment in all senses and ecology. And you see that threading through as a theme in a lot of poets' works. It's all over Muldoon, it's all over Donnelly. Joy Graham, upset, her books never, never, it's like never, never again, never again, never, and it's like, oh my God. So I sort of feel like, again, if there's this sort of thinking of poets as sort of registering antennae, people know that this is, whatever you think about it, it's a thing in the air people are concerned about, and so it's no surprise that it's permeating poetry as content. But it's also interesting to see people trying to think about either do they feel that their work in poetry no longer matters to them in the same way? Are they interested in different kinds of collaborative projects? Are they interested in new forms of writing? I think Spar was trying to create a circular poetics that was going to be more encompassing. So I also am actually a little skeptical of catastrophism, because I sort of feel like there's always a disaster. And not that this might not be a definitive, but I also feel like if you look at Blake, if you look at people writing in states of emergency, there are there's a long history of having to think about emergency and all the sensitive things emerging and things being under enormous duress. And I think it's really important to station oneself in the language and in one's thought, and to not kind of lapse into a kind of premature hysteria. You know, and I feel like it's some poetry. Anyway, that's one of my. It's a big hobby horse I have too in terms of.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about
Not you.
hysteria.
Not you. No, you know what I mean in terms of.
I know. I was thinking more about despair rather than hysteria. You know.
Yeah, but I feel despair. That's like a human muse, right?
Not to say that
that's
personally in despair, but a desperate situation. You know.
I would suggest two books to read by a poet of essays would be two by Brinkhorst, The Tree of Meaning, and Everywhere Being is Dancing. If you can read these, they'll write down what you, I think, want.
I was saying that, yes. And this was, he was a revelation for me. I mean, no, but I did a story about Gary Snyder, who was our guest here. I took him to the class for the PhD students. Then I took him for a sightseeing tour around Olomouc. So we went from one monument to another, church and so. And I saw that he was getting sort of tired. So we ended up in the park here. And like one of our politicians who is famous for embracing trees, when he's drunk, I think. But Gary was not drunk, but we were sort of passing by a beautiful tree and embraced it. It's such beautiful trees you have here, it says. And said, I felt, and I asked, so you did not really like the sightseeing center? He says, too much Baroque.
Well, he's very down to earth. One time when he was staying with me when I was building my place, I had an apartment and we were out building it, and then we were staying there. And at the time, somehow it was getting cold, and the ground was frozen. But I neglected to build the outhouse first, and we still didn't have plumbing. And it was a difficult situation even for Snyder, who's down supposedly very earthy. And he admonished me. He says, I was pretty young then. He said, you must always know the outhouse gets built first, then the house. Then the road. And the cathedrals.
This is where my grandfather was. We start with the outhouse. And it was an outhouse. It wasn't part of the... Any more suggestions?
Well, I wanted to ask something, poet and performer, because poetry must be promoted, of course, and there are many festivals dedicated to poetry, but not all poets are able to read aloud, to perform. So I would like to know your opinion on this, because I think that festivals do a lot of good job for poetry, especially if they are dedicated to it, just to it. Like there is a wonderful festival, Zebra Film Festival, if you know poetry in Berlin, very good.
In where?
Berlin. It's growing, it's really very good. Then we collaborate with Scottish Poetry Library, Hay Festival, which is not just dedicated to poetry, but it's now a very prestigious festival. So I wanted to know more about
You
this.
saw what tasteful sort of poetry reading last night.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So if you can say something.
And as you can see, I mean, all these three poets, did very, very well. So,
Well, I remember
yes,
once we
okay.
had Yehida Amikai at our book fair, because I'm running the book fair in Prague. And I asked him, because he was such a gentleman and really so kind, and he did not look like a performer at all, but I asked him, how do you feel here? Because you must act, you must do something here. And he said, well, like everybody else who produce something, I must sell my products. So something about this.
Are you selling when you read?
I didn't think so.
You sound that way and you do not feel it in your pocket, right?
I pay people to take our books.
That's nice. That's nice.
I just see it as a fact that, take the example of Seamus Heaney, he is a brilliant performer and presenter of his work. He's a very kind, outgoing, warm person, and yet one of his co-evolves in Northern Ireland was Derek Mann, who is everything Seamus Heaney is not. As a performer, as a person, I think he's a fantastic poet, and I would like to call myself his friend as well. But he deals with the public aspect of poetry very badly, and it's hard. You wonder, is this the reason why his reputation has not prospered in the way he needs to? I don't know. It might also be just the poetry, that it didn't, strike the right tone at the right time, that America wasn't able to tune into it, which is so crucial to establishing a world reputation that he now has. It's hard to say what is the exact cause, but I personally feel that it's one of the main factors.
Then again, Wallace Stevens hated to give readings.
But that was the time before. That was the time before.
Yeah.
It also, I mean, it seems like there's somebody like, for example, Frederick Seidel doesn't give readings at all. Sort of a kind of, I don't know if it's a point of pride or a position. And I think everyone knows or has been to readings where some people, they're just terrific. They're very charismatic, or they're just really good performers, and then you go and maybe you really liked a poet, and then you go to hear them read, you're like, oh, you're like, I'd rather be home with your book. There's always, I always feel like even if the reading is bad, there's always something interesting, right? It's like, what did they choose to wear? What is their accent? It's like human things, right? You discover human things about a human being. I feel at the end of the day, and maybe this is the wrong thing to say to you, I feel at the end of the day it's epiphenomenal. I mean, I feel at the end, it's about, you're doing, and I've been to readings that I found just wonderful and illuminating, but as a poet, I feel like that's a thing, and I'm always, honored and happy to do it, but I feel like it's absolutely phenomenal to mine. But I also am not, there's a whole group of people who are artists as performance poets, and this is part of their compositional, logic, and part of how they understand their art. So I think it's a very interesting sociological thing, though. The question of the poetry read and also people talk about the official hush. I mean, U.S. poetry readings, they're just, the bogosity, it's enormous, because, you've been to ones where you have really wonderful, charismatic people, and you've been to other ones, but the audience has the same affect because they're going to poetry church. And it's like, oh! And that's just, but partly, I think festivals, it's very, it's a festival, right? And it means that there are more people there, there's more of a social occasion, people will only be getting a drink afterward. It's more the administrated, thing, like the writing program that is bringing it. And as a person who's been to those and given those, they can be wonderful. But you can also feel like a cookie cutter experience, and now the person's going to shuffle their papers, and now they're going to pretend they don't know what they're going to read. And it's like, oh God! Yeah. So again, the kind of satirizable element of it. But at the end of the day, I think it depends on where you might fall on the spectrum, how you understand your work. Is it more a performance-based kind of work? Is it more a writerly kind of? Is it a hybrid kind of work? If you're a writer or a performer, how do you think about it? But if I were a programmer, or if I'm recommending things to students, then it's wonderful. People have been so turned on to things through readings that they never would have on the page. And often it's a really interesting conversation to have, the disjunction between how you read it at home and then what it was to hear. Wasn't it you who was talking about when you heard Ashbery read and you were like, yes! but you couldn't bottle that, right? So, again, it's a kind of swirly response to your question. But part of me is actually very, I do feel like that's about, being alive in a social situation, but it has actually nothing to do, personally for me, with my sense of the art, even though I'm hugely interested in oral and traditionary poetries and folk poetries.
There are times when you come and hear somebody famous, where you think maybe the poet was mute and rendered an actor to perform. I mean, I'm sitting, I was wondering before mass communication, whether the same poet actually appeared in many different towns, and they didn't know it, what he looked like. And especially at the time, all you needed was a big gray beard and to be able to recite. On the other hand, isn't it true that Richard Burton's, was this the face that launched the 1,000 ships, is a lot better than probably Christopher Marlowe or Peter Van.
You'll never know.
Get the Ouija board.
Well, I think the advantage of festivals, I mean, it has an advantage and disadvantage. I agree with Marie. Sometimes you hear a poet for the first time reading their own poetry, and you sort of like the poetry a little bit before, and you got it. But once you hear their version of their voice or rhythm, sometimes you come back with a changed view, for better or worse, of the poem. So the festivals do, I think, provide this in the sense of anthologies do in another way. Of course, it can go the other way, because I think the ear is, of course, eclectic, but it also it's a trained instrument, and when you hear and sometimes you hear something for the first time, you've never read it, you think it's great, and then you go to read it on the page and you realize that it was purely performance. We have an interesting, maybe you know her, she's based in New York. I don't, as far as her poetry is concerned, I don't much like it, but she's an incredible performer, Eileen Miles. She does lots of things with poetry, if you want, on this sense of mixed media. Do you ever hear her in New York? She's around in certain circles.
She's very charismatic.
Yeah, very charismatic. So she has this, but when you read anything on the page, it doesn't really. But then of course you question where does poetry belong? On the page or in the air?
Now we have had here a few American poets who left very sort of impact here. Anne Waldman was mentioned today, someone spoke her, so she was here in the aula, very, very lively, very memorable, very loud.
She had a band.
Yeah, well, here, no, this was Saka, she was here with the band, but she was here on her own. That we wanted to offer a mic. A mic, she says. A mic?
I am a mic.
So, this is speaking about I went to a reading at Boston College. The reader was supposed to be Robert Lowell. It was packed. The big room was packed. And then they announced that the poet will be there in a couple of minutes. Well, it took about 10, and then he came very quietly, shyly, sat down, and started reading. The volume of the room and the people, etc., was too much. We didn't hear them. So someone, like in America, it would happen, it would not happen here. Louder! Can hear you! Put the book together, closed it, put it on the table, and left.
25,000.
And came back, because people saw that they knew what was going to happen. Came back an hour later. But people were there still in the course of the event, so it was very, very dramatic. Another drama from a poet's reading. So Ulrich Kinnell was here. He's very good. He's wonderful. But Allen Ginsberg, as you know, it was mentioned, was here in '93 in the morning before our reading in the local theater. He says, "I don't feel well, Joseph." So I say, "Okay, I'll take you to my doctor at the hospital." So I took him there, and so left him there. I say, "Oh, if I come back, it will be good." The doctor calls me an hour later. Says, "Well, he's very, very sick. I don't think that he should move to say nothing about do anything like teach or solve or perform. He cannot do that. It's okay. So I went there to pick him up and take him to the hotel. And I asked the doctor, so what is it? Well, he says, his kidneys are dead. I said, well, I'm not a doctor, but I mean, the kidneys don't die. In 1 minute or 1 moment. So they must have been dead when he came. So he doesn't feel well, I understand that. So what can we do about that? Because he still has to leave, this country with his kidneys, dead or not dead. Well, so I said, well, can you encourage him or do him something so that he does not feel bad feelings? So I gave him something, sort of some drug, I took him to the hotel. And I was worried and I wanted to cancel the reading. The house was full, of course, here. And I picked up, I went to see him, are you ready? How could we do that? He said, sure. Stand up, and we went there. For 2 hours, I was dead, like his kidney. I couldn't do anything anymore. But Ellen was very lively, full of energy. I don't know where he was. He had a sort of reserve battery somewhere. And we were on and on and on. So we were singing then Greek songs and so together. And this was, well, it finished and he dropped. Not dead, but I'm totally exhausted. So whenever he was there, sort of on stage, I don't know where he was getting the energy from. And he was very lively. He was not even pretending sort of forced. It was very forceful. Yeah. So there are various sort of readings as you were saying. All right. Any more suggestions for poets that we have not mentioned yet and that we should read or perform or invite home or invite here? Yes.
I was going to suggest that we, during one of these meetings, could look at the waves of fashion in poetry. I mean, one of my wives, great, said to me, "What are you doing?"
That will be the number. In sequence or?
I'm leading up something. We are studying how awful the situation is for the American Negro, we said in those days. Okay, she says, what will come next? Oh, how awful it is for the Native Americans will be next. Okay. And then, and then how awful it is for women. Yes. And now we should worry about the environment. I mean, I think it's slightly scandalous that all of academia is totally caught up in waves of fashion with very little independence. And I think that should be taken up. Poets who try not to be caught up in what sells right now.
Well, don't you think that if we pick that up, we would in fact enhance? This is what I felt, when people complain about popular culture, and they say, film and popular culture now is taking over, that's the real study of literature. I said, but you are helping it, in fact, introducing sort of courses that ask the students to see films instead of reading books. So you are bored, in fact, without knowing it, or if you know it, at least you know what your pocket is worth. So I don't know. I mean, maybe yes. All ideas by Jan are, of course, worth thinking about.
It's not his, it's his wife's.
Now I will have a line that is poetic. He is his wife's. Yes. All right. So, any more suggestions? If not, what time is it? It's the time.
Did we change the talk tonight here?
Yes.
Tonight, so be aware that you're traveling.
1 hour back?
1 hour back tonight.
So
That's right.
someone's train is at 12, it is in fact at 1.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, or no?
You have one.
I think.
Yes,
Or at 11.
The other way.
It's
Right, 1 hour less.
Okay, so if I wake
That's
up
what I
at
said in
7,
the
it will
morning.
be 6.
6.
Okay.
So you can have 1 more hour.
Okay, yes.
One, you gain
You can
an
sleep
hour.
one more hour. Yes.
Yeah, you gain an hour.
Okay. Now, let me thank the panelists. Let me thank you. Let's have a short break, and then we have to ask for younger generation sort of presentations that we will be looking for. All right? Before we split and go and meet again to the farewell dinner.
Where's
the same
that?
place? The same place where we had lunch.
Goulash. Goulash it may be, but